When it comes to the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, CISA, people sometimes forget the I word. Cyber topics seem to consume all of the oxygen. But physical infrastructure threats are also real and often connected to the cyber side. We get more now from CISA's Executive Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security, David Mussington. Dr. Mussington, good to have you with us.
Good to be here. Thank you.
I want to go back to your title, Executive Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security. That's a wide-sounding type of portfolio that you have. And, at the beginning of DHS in the post-9/11 era, people worried about physical infrastructure, bridges, roads, and, in fact, that's something they should worry about. But the cyber piece, and that component, is increasingly part of the physical infrastructure, process industries, and so on. And vice versa, because even the cyber infrastructure has towers and wires and data centers and so forth. So how do you look at that? How do you really separate cyber and infrastructure in terms of the day-to-day oversight that you do?
So, increasingly, and I should say that obviously it's a team sport, and there's a cybersecurity executive assistant director as well, Eric Goldstein. The agency name really tells you how we do it. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency encompasses all hazards, risks to infrastructure function. That means physical threats, the terrorism and counterterrorism risks that you elaborated on at the beginning, and cyber threats, which are newer, which are due to the network nature of physical systems, and the physical infrastructures that have a cyber layer attached to them. Think about a water and wastewater treatment system that is connected to the public internet, for example, and what would happen if you disrupt that cyber connectivity. Most of our critical infrastructures are that way, from airports to pipelines to government facilities and government services. So while human beings may live in physical buildings, they communicate over wires and over frequencies that are subject to disruption. That's the cyber part of it, the emergency communications part of it. The physical part of it's still here, and we worry about bomb threats and physical attacks and risks to physical facilities like churches and schools. All of that encompasses into the critical infrastructure risk challenge.
And from CISA, and in dealing with CISA, the cyber side gets all of the publicity. That's all the releases coming out.
Much publicity, not all, but much of it, yeah.
Maybe review for us what's happening on the physical infrastructure protection side. And I'll give you an example just from my own experience. I used to do a lot of running around the big reservoir in Central Park in New York City. And that was fenced off because it was a reservoir, the Jackie Onassis Reservoir. But I was always thinking somebody could come there in the night with a bucket of poison, get over that little fence and dump it in there or something like that. Physical security, or somebody climbing under the George Washington Bridge and doing something nefarious. What is CISA's approach on that end of things?
So what we do is we collaborate with the people who own those infrastructures, the assets themselves, and that's mostly state and local governments and to the extent the private sector. And we advise them and collaborate with them to make sure that the best protections available are deployed to those locations. And that means fencing, in the example you gave, to keep people away from particularly vulnerable areas. It means advising them on the level of threat. So if we have information or intelligence information about threats and challenges, risks in the field, we collaborate and tell them about it. And we tell them about best practices that they can adopt to add layers of protection. We also make available our assessments of risk, because we have a risk assessment program on the physical side where we assess dams, tunnels, bridges, and et cetera, against categories of threat, from explosive devices through physical threats from domestic violent extremists, for example. And we provide guidance on how best to protect, and certainly how to liaise with first responders to make sure that if an incident should take place, that those assets can be protected as quickly and as viably as possible. So it's best practices advice, it's assessments, and it is engagement through our field force. We have 10 regions and protective security advisors, which provide security advice for how to secure particular facilities and critical infrastructure.
And some of the critical infrastructure, a fair amount, is privately owned.
The most commonly articulated statistic is over 80%. The great majority, that's, I think, a safe generalization.
And do you find that there are differing levels of willingness to cooperate across different sectors?
So over the 20 years or more that I've worked on this topic, I think that I've seen it go from grudging collaboration to a much more acceptance of the shared risk between the public and the private sector. and a level of trust between CISA and private critical infrastructure operators that they recognize the threat and they're willing to collaborate with us to lower the risk, at least attempt to talk about the risk in a way that wasn't true a decade ago. So I'm pretty optimistic when it comes to that.
We're speaking with Dr. David Mussington. He's Executive Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Just out of curiosity, tell us about how you came to this type of work. You've taught it, you've practiced it, and now you, I guess, practice and oversee it.
Right. So I've been here since the beginning of this administration. I was appointed in February of 2021. Prior to that, I was a university professor at the University of Maryland, College Park, where I taught on homeland security and critical infrastructure resilience. Long career from Rand Corporation to doing postdoctoral work at Harvard on national security threats. And this is just sort of the domain area where I've specialized for a while, on the cyber and the physical side of the house.
And getting back to risks to physical infrastructure, one of them is lack of maintenance. And we've seen that often, well, both public and private. Bridges do fall once in a while in the United States, land on the highway below, this kind of thing. And I think of like radio towers, which are privately owned, that are really tall, and if they ever flipped over, Lord knows what they would hit on the way down. Does CISA mission bridge over into best practices and shared information on keeping things just in good repair as a part of security?
A couple of things about that. First, it's mostly about how those vulnerabilities can be exploited to negative effect. So as an all hazards agency, we focus on the fragility of infrastructure, of course, and if infrastructure fails, then there can be security and risk consequences. So that's probably one of the oldest focus points of CISA. A different focus is when weak or vulnerable infrastructure can be exploited by bad actors, and those bad actors can know where vulnerabilities are less likely to be remediated and can choose those times and places of their choosing to act out. And we worry a lot about that. To the extent of strengthening weaker infrastructure, we leverage things like the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act of 2021 that programs billions of dollars to improve the physical shape of infrastructure. That infrastructure can be rebuilt, internalizing standards of best practice and protection that are new to protect against older risks. So we'll provide advice on how to rebuild infrastructure to make it stronger and more resilient. That's our principal injection point into this.
And does this work extend even further back, say, into the engineering and construction of new infrastructure that could be done differently?
It does. We have principles like secure by design and secure by default, where we try and make sure the security standards and best practices of construction on the cyber and physical side are included in the design of newer infrastructure, so that the newer infrastructure will be more resilient than the infrastructure it replaces. So that's part of it.
And having a broad overview of this, is there any particular sector, and I know you love them all equally, but one that you feel, this is the one I'd like to see have the most advancement in?
I will defer picking on a particular infrastructure, but I will say that everyone can improve. And I think that IIJA, that Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that I mentioned, programs potential improvements across a myriad of infrastructures, all of which are venues where security standards and practices can be deployed, and we can end up with a much stronger set of resilient infrastructures than we have right now.
Dr. David Mussington is Executive Assistant Director for Infrastructure Security at the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. Thanks so much for joining me.
You're very welcome.
And we'll post this interview at federalnewsnetwork.com/Federal Drive. Subscribe to the Federal Drive wherever you get your podcasts.